It was June of 1988, and 71-year-old Myra Davis could hardly contain her excitement. Just when she thought her working days were over, the former Hollywood actress was suddenly back in the entertainment business. As Myra stepped out the front door of her modest home in Cheviot Hills, California, the attractive grandmother with the high cheekbones and easy smile wasted no time in heading for the garage at the back of her property. During her 50-year-long career in show business, Myra had developed a reputation for being punctual, reliable, and hardworking. And even though her days of appearing in Hollywood movies were over, her career starring in commercial TV ads had just begun. And Myra, ever the professional, was determined to build just as good a reputation in her new line of work as she had built in her old line of work. Walking briskly down the driveway to the car parked in the garage at the back of her property, Myra made a note of not looking over at her neighbor's house. She didn't want her good mood spoiled by the sight of the owner's teenage son staring out his window at her. A minute or so later, and Myra had slipped behind the wheel of her tan and brown Chevrolet Malibu, turned the key in the ignition, and was backing out of her driveway onto her quiet residential street. As Myra pulled away from the single-story white bungalow and headed west to the city of Los Angeles, she couldn't help but think of all the changes she had seen during her 40 years in that house and in the entertainment business she loved so much. Myra knew that she was incredibly lucky to have had a career in Hollywood that spanned more than 46 years, let alone this second chance now as an older woman to get regular employment with TV ad agencies. But then again, not everyone who headed for Hollywood would have been satisfied with the kind of practical career decisions Myra had always made for herself. Because the key to Myra's success was the fact that she had kept her ambitions fairly modest, and she never yielded to the temptations and distractions of fame, drugs, alcohol, or scandalous affairs. The same had not been true of her husband. After having achieved moderate success as a cowboy actor when Myra met and married him in 1934, Robert Davis died of an overdose 37 years later. And over the course of that long and often troubled marriage, not only did Myra take care of the couple's two sons, she was also the one who kept getting offers of more work. In fact, ever since Myra had left her hometown of Albuquerque, New Mexico at the age of 14, migrated to California, and landed a bit part with Hollywood Studio, she'd carved out a niche for herself not as a famous actress, but as someone whose role was to support those famous actresses. After starting out as a dancer, Myra soon shifted gears from what studio called first team work, which was done by leading actors and actresses, to second team technical assistants that rarely resulted in getting your name listed in any film credits. Even though she still took the occasional role as a dancer or made an on-camera cameo appearance, Myra's bread and butter had quickly become her work as a stand-in or body double. A body double is someone who actually replaces the star during filming. A stand-in is a person who replaces the star during the setup of movie scenes, when lighting, camera, and sound technicians spend hours preparing for or rehearsing an actual scene. As Myra loved to tell her 32-year-old granddaughter, Myra had preferred being a stand-in, because stand-ins nearly always got steady work, and because Myra didn't do any nude work like many body doubles did. At the thought of her granddaughter, Myra smiled. With Myra's help and encouragement, Sherry had followed in her grandmother's footsteps, and by the age of 19, Sherry was also getting regular work in Hollywood. Now 32, Sherry had actually eclipsed Myra's career. Sherry had more in front of the camera acting roles than she did behind-the-scenes stand-in work. But as far as Myra's granddaughter was concerned, it was still Myra's work on one of the most iconic and famous horror movies in history that was her family's crowning Hollywood achievement. That movie was the 1960 thriller titled Psycho. Shot in black and white and directed by the legendary Alfred Hitchcock, Psycho is best known for its gruesome murder scene. In that scene, the character, who was played by actress Janet Leigh, is stabbed to death while taking a shower. Although Myra was not the body double who did the nude work in that famous shower scene, Myra did spend weeks on set standing in for Janet Leigh during the shower scene lighting setups. And Myra also played the on-camera part of the murderer, who shows up in the movie as a shadowy knife-wielding figure on the other side of the almost but not quite transparent shower curtain. In real life, Myra could not have been more different from that character. Among family and friends, she was known for her kindness and generosity, as well as the upbeat attitude with which she had faced the hardships in her life and career. But even though Myra continued to work as a stand-in and body double right through the late 1970s, it was still her appearance in Psycho that seemed to define her career. None of her roles before or after ever matched the reaction Myra got when people knew that she had worked on that shower scene with Janet Leigh. And in 1977, when Myra finally retired at the age of 61, it would take all of that resilience and optimism to adjust to the reality that as much as she loved the entertainment industry, the movies, and the people she had met, she would never again appear either in front of or behind the camera on a Hollywood movie set. But just over a year earlier, all that had changed. Just as Myra had been the person who introduced her granddaughter to a career in show business, it had been her granddaughter, Sherry, who had only recently introduced her grandmother to the talent agents who went on to hire Myra to play a leading role in commercial TV ads. Now, joining the flow of cars all streaming into Los Angeles that morning, Myra's memories of the past gave way to the satisfaction she felt right this moment. Whether she was in a backstage dressing room in Hollywood having a cup of coffee with Janet Leigh, or pitching home-style cookies or rental cars on TV, it was all showbiz to Myra. Gripping the wheel of her car a little tighter, Myra glanced at her watch. She had just enough driving time left to do a few mental run-throughs of that day's script before she arrived at the TV studio. A few weeks later, at 10:30 a.m. on Sunday, July 3rd, Sherry Davis pulled into the driveway of her grandmother's white bungalow at 2917 South Beverly Drive. An hour earlier, Myra's son and Sherry's uncle out in Idaho had called Sherry to say he could not get in touch with Myra, and would Sherry just drive in person to Myra's house to make sure there was nothing wrong. And as soon as Sherry drew her car to a stop and saw the stack of newspapers piled up against her grandmother's front door, an alarm bell started going off in Sherry's mind. Myra, who loved to do the daily crossword puzzle in the newspapers, would never let her newspapers pile up like that, any more than she would leave her tan and brown Chevy Malibu parked outside the garage long enough to gather the thick layer of dust Sherry was seeing on the car right now as she now made her way to the front door of her grandmother's house. Even though Sherry could see a light on just inside the house, the door was locked. And even after knocking and ringing the bell and calling out to her grandmother that it was her, Sherry, there was no answer, and no sound of movement from inside the house. Sherry's chest suddenly felt tight. She knew her grandmother rarely left the house before noon unless she had a work assignment. Moving several steps to her right, Sherry saw that the curtains were still drawn over the big 6-pane glass front window that looked into the living room. That wasn't like Myra either. She kept her ground-level bedroom drapes closed, but opening the curtains in other rooms meant she could keep the overhead lights off and save a little on her electric bill. Walking around to the back of the house, Sherry went to the one window that she knew was always unlocked and uncovered. It was a small pane of glass set high up on the exterior wall of Myra's bedroom. Myra always left it uncovered so her beloved cats could sit inside on the sill and look out at the world. A few moments later, standing on top of an outdoor table she had positioned below that small opening, Sherry was looking down at her grandmother's bed. And what Sherry saw was so horrifying, she had to catch herself to keep from falling. And even after Sherry had jumped off that low table and run back to the front of the house, she was still trying to process what she'd just glimpsed through that window. For a second, Sherry looked over at the neighbor's house, but instead of asking them for help, Sherry jumped into her car, and when she couldn't find a payphone near her grandmother's house, she drove as fast as she could back to Playa del Rey, where her house was. Stumbling in through the front door, Sherry told her husband, John, exactly what she had seen. By the time first responders had arrived at Myra's house on South Beverly Drive that Sunday morning, Sherry's husband was there to meet them. Unlike Sherry, John had brought the keys to Myra's house with him, and a moment later, the emergency medical technicians had unlocked the door to the little white bungalow. But it would turn out that the medics and police were much, much too late to help Myra. The 71-year-old grandmother lay on her bed, the bedspread and sheets bunched underneath her. Naked from the waist down, her belly was distended, and her maggot-infested body was already in an advanced stage of decomposition. A little over an hour before, when Sherry had looked through the small window into her grandmother's bedroom and seen her grandmother's swollen and lifeless body, Sherry had told herself that Myra must have died of a heart attack or some other natural cause, and that the condition of her body must be due to the fact that Myra had been lying there undiscovered for days. But Sherry's assumption had been wrong. There had been nothing natural at all about her grandmother's death. According to police, the woman who now lay on that rumpled bed and who had once famously played the role of the murderer in the hit movie Psycho had herself been violently raped and then strangled to death with a pair of her own nylon stockings. Cheviot Hills, where Myra lived, was not a high-crime area. Located west of Los Angeles, it was a modest but affluent neighborhood that had, over the years, been home to many actors like Myra and her husband. With its views of the local golf course and country club, it was a place where residents felt safe, and where murders like this just did not happen. But despite the public pressure to find and punish the person who killed Myra, right from the start, the investigation into her death was complicated, not only by the delay in discovering Myra's body, but also by a lack of suspects and obvious motives. By the time Los Angeles detective Gary Fullerton began his investigation into Myra's homicide, collecting physical evidence, swabbing the body for DNA, snapping pictures, and dusting for fingerprints, the medical examiner's autopsy report estimated that Myra had already been dead for 8 days. And looking at the crime scene, Detective Fullerton's first assumption was that Myra had been the victim of a random burglary, meaning she may not have had any personal connection to her killer. To Detective Fullerton, it looked like someone had rifled through Myra's nightstand and ransacked her dresser. In addition, the contents of Myra's purse were scattered across the bedspread and floor. But Sherry, who was absolutely stunned to find out that her grandmother had been murdered, had no trouble at all coming up with a potential suspect. Within hours of her grandmother's death, Sherry had directed police attention to the house immediately adjacent to Myra's property. Although it was no larger than Myra's own small 3-bedroom home, the neighbor's house seemed to be overflowing with people. At any given time, the owner, a woman named Adrienne Rosenfeld, played host to up to 8 different residents. Those included Adrienne's older teenage son, her 2 adult daughters, and their partners, along with 3 of Adrienne's grandchildren. According to Sherry, both she and her grandmother had suspected Adrienne's son, Joel Steen, of spying on them from his bedroom window, as well as making unwanted advances and visits to the house when Sherry was visiting her grandmother. Sherry said that Myra had even gone so far as to say that she was actively afraid of the young man. Sherry herself was uncomfortable enough with his behavior that even after discovering her grandmother's body, Sherry did not want to ask anyone in that house if she could use their phone to call 911. As for the other occupants of that house, Sherry said her grandmother got along well enough with Adrienne, who owned a nearby nail salon, and aside from the family's constant bickering, neither Sherry or her grandmother had had any issues with the older daughter's husband or the younger daughter's boyfriend who did odd jobs around the neighborhood. But what seemed like a promising first lead quickly led to what would become a series of dead ends. After interviewing Adrienne and her family members and guests and checking their alibis, Detective Fullerton eventually came back to Myra's family and said he'd cleared everyone, including Adrienne's son, of any involvement. Instead, based on conversations with an assortment of neighbors, as well as some of Myra's family members and people she knew through her work at the TV studio, the detective had a new name at the top of his suspect list, and that person was none other than Sherry's own younger brother. According to Myra's neighbors, Myra's 31-year-old grandson, a known drug abuser who had a history of asking Myra for money, had recently been living at Myra's house. And although Myra's grandson would later provide investigators with an alibi and pass a lie detector test, he would remain a person of interest to the Los Angeles police force, especially when every other lead that Detective Fullerton pursued in the weeks that followed came up completely empty. And months later, when the Myra Davis murder case ground to a halt and the murder file was quietly shelved alongside dozens of other unsolved cold cases handled by the Los Angeles County Police Department, Sherry's brother remained under that cloud of suspicion. Ten years later, early on the afternoon of Sunday, March 29, 1998, 38-year-old Debbie McAllister picked up the telephone. She was sitting in her home in San Clemente, a city of 47,000 people that was perched right on the white sand beach of California's southern coast. Once again, Debbie dialed the number of her mother's apartment 90 miles north in West Los Angeles, a residential area not far from Cheviot Hills. And once again, at the other end of the line, she heard the busy signal. Debbie's mother, Jean Orof, had called Debbie earlier that day to fill Debbie in on news about a mutual acquaintance. At the time, Debbie, a single working mom with a 15-year-old son, had been swamped with household chores. Not wanting to miss any of the details, Debbie had told her mom that Debbie would call back that afternoon when both of them could settle in for an unhurried conversation. Now, putting the telephone receiver back in its cradle, Debbie pushed the first flicker of worry out of her mind. Maybe her mother had taken the phone off the hook while she went down to do laundry in the basement of her apartment complex, and then forgotten to hang the receiver back up before going out to visit with one of her many friends. But still, it seemed a little unusual. Then again, Debbie certainly did not know all the ins and outs of her mom's weekend routine. Although the two women were very close, their relationship was complicated. Jean had divorced Debbie's father when Debbie was just 2 years old and Jean was in her early 20s. 12 years after that, Jean had left their extended family in New York and moved with Debbie out to Los Angeles, California. Once on the West Coast, Jean had worked hard to support the two of them. And as soon as they had settled into the one-bedroom unit in a modern apartment complex on Bentley Ave, where Jean still lived, Debbie had spent a lot of time alone and unsupervised. Jean had known the arrangement was not ideal, but it was the only way that Jean could work during the day and attend a night course that would allow her to get certified and employed as a surgical dental assistant. Jean Orof had never remarried, but she had always had plenty of admirers, and Debbie knew how much her mother prided herself on her youthful appearance. Nature had blessed Jean with thick dark hair, blue-green eyes, and a good figure, and Jean always made sure that her makeup and manicured nails were perfect. By the time she was closing in on 40, Jean had begun a long-term relationship with a wealthy young man in his 20s, and having a 17-year-old daughter in the one-bedroom apartment led to just enough friction between the two women that Debbie decided at that point to move out and begin living on her own. When Debbie's son, Andrew, was born 6 years later, Debbie had wondered how her mother would adjust to the idea that she was now old enough to be a grandmother, a title that definitely challenged Jean's determination to look and act as young as she felt. But it would turn out that Jean absolutely loved little Andrew, and as she leaned hard into her role as grandmother, any strain between Jean and Debbie had faded. Despite the 90-mile distance between them, Jean often used the weekend to make the 2-hour drive south to San Clemente. She would pack her bag and hop into her beloved red and white Chevrolet Malibu that she had bought for herself more than 20 years ago. Then she'd roll down the windows and head for the coast, full of plans for how she and Andrew would spend the next couple of days. Now, almost 15 years after Andrew's arrival, Debbie knew that her mother had just passed 2 more difficult milestones. Just 5 months earlier, Jean had turned 60 and had officially joined the ranks of older Americans. But even worse, the man Jean had been seeing for almost 20 years had announced that he'd asked another, much younger woman to marry him. Overall, though, Debbie had the sense that her mom was meeting these challenges with her usual resilience. From a practical standpoint, Debbie knew that her mother was independent and self-sufficient. The local Avon lady, who sold makeup and skincare products to Jean at her home, was married to a man who could help Jean with any minor repairs around her apartment. And from a social perspective, Jean was keeping herself upbeat and busy. Not long ago, her mom and her mom's good friend, Barbara Capadal, had gone to the Los Angeles Dodgers Stadium to hear Jean's favorite rock and roll band, the Rolling Stones. And in late October, just a few days after turning 60, Jean and Barbara had gone to an elaborate Halloween party that was put on each year by Jean's manicurist. And in February, just 1 month earlier, Jean had booked tickets for a trip she and Andrew would take to Disney World later that year. And just 11 days earlier, Debbie knew that Jean, along with Jean's younger sister and their mother, had gotten together for lunch, a monthly engagement that had started after Debbie's aunt and grandmother had joined Jean and Debbie out on the West Coast. Finally, Debbie told herself to stop worrying. It was good that her mom was busy or having a marathon phone call with a friend. And besides, her mom had sounded just fine when Debbie talked with her earlier that morning. At about 5 p.m. the next day, on the afternoon of Sunday, March 29th, Jean's friend, Barbara, left her apartment in the complex that she and Jean shared and climbed the one flight of steps up to Jean's unit. Both women lived alone, and over the years they had become very good friends, so it was natural that when Jean's mother had not been able to reach her daughter by phone at all that day, that Jean's mother would finally call Barbara and ask her to check that Jean was okay. But it wasn't until Barbara saw the Sunday newspaper still on the floor outside Jean's door, and Jean did not answer the bell, that Barbara felt her own first wave of concern. And when Barbara tried the door and found it swung inward under her hand, that concern turned to alarm. Jean was always careful to keep her doors locked, and even when she was expecting company, Jean always used an intercom and buzzer to greet people before letting them inside. The first thing Barbara noticed when she walked into Jean's apartment was the smell of smoke, not from Jean's cigarettes, but more the smell of fabric burning. But even as Barbara pinned what the smell was down, she came to a sudden, horrified stop. The door to Jean's bedroom was open, and from where Barbara stood just a few feet away, she could see Jean's naked body sprawled face down across the king-sized bed. Jean's feet, hanging over the edge of the mattress, were blue, there was blood around Jean's head, and then Barbara saw the source of the smoky smell she had noticed when she first walked in. The dust ruffle around the bottom of the bed had been partially burned, and even though the fire had burned itself out, there was something so off about Jean's lifeless and discolored body that Barbara did not have to check for a pulse to know that her friend was dead. And even as Barbara began to back out of the apartment before turning to run down the stairs to her own unit, where she would call 911, other details of the scene seared themselves into Barbara's memory. The way Jean's body looked like it had been thrown onto the bed, the phone on the floor rather than on the nightstand, and the receiver off its cradle. Then there was the uncharacteristically messy pile of towels heaped on the floor in the bathroom instead of folded neatly on the towel racks, and that blood around her friend's long dark hair. And as Barbara picked up the phone and dialed 911, her brain kept screaming one single word: murder. But within the next hour, as first responders from the fire, police, and emergency medical unit flooded into the apartment complex on Bentley Avenue, Los Angeles County Police Sergeant Christopher Giles was forming a very different impression of what had caused the death of 60-year-old Jean Orof. After observing Jean's body and learning that Jean was a heavy smoker and that she took heart medication, Detective Giles announced that the victim had likely died of natural causes like a heart attack, and that the fire must have been caused by Jean dropping a lit cigarette. This assessment was met with blank silence before the fire captain, whose crew had also responded to the 911 call, pointed out to the detective that people who die of heart attacks are usually found lying face up, not face down. The fire captain also pointed to a red crease on Jean's neck. And to him, not only did the fact that the phone was off the hook seem unusual and possibly suspicious, the burned bed skirt looked more like a deliberate arson attempt than an accidental fire. But not only did Detective Giles dismiss those concerns, the county coroner would later agree with Detective Giles and rule that Jean had, in fact, died of a heart attack. So, on March 30th, 1998, one day after Barbara had discovered Jean's body, Jean's sister and her sister's husband arrived at the morgue, grief-stricken by Jean's unexpected and tragic death, to make arrangements for Jean's body to be cremated. And that would have been the end of any further investigation into the death of Jean Orof, if not for the work of a sharp-eyed public official who noticed two important errors in the paperwork provided by the county coroner's office. It turned out that Jean's own doctor did not believe that Jean's heart condition was serious enough to have caused a fatal heart attack, and he had refused to sign off on the coroner's death certificate. Not only that, but no one from the coroner's office had ever examined Jean's body at her apartment or filed an official record of Jean's death. So, on April 2nd, 5 days after Jean's body had been discovered, and 1 day after her grieving family had gone forward with her memorial service, an investigator with the coroner's office arrived at the morgue to do a second examination of Jean's body before releasing her remains to the family. But as soon as the investigator arrived at the morgue and opened the plastic cover that encased Jean Orlof's dead body, he knew that there would be nothing routine about the examination of this body. The red crease that the fire captain had noticed on Jean's neck had deepened to a dark purple bruise. There was also a trail of bruises from Jean's cheekbones down to her lower legs, and tiny red spots filled the whites of Jean's eyes. It was instantly clear to the investigator that Jean had not died of natural causes. She had been strangled to death. Not only would an autopsy confirm this, it would also show that Jean had been sexually assaulted. And even before that autopsy was completed, a new investigation into Jean's death was underway. This time, the lead detectives were two highly respected police officers, Francine Maunger and Ron Phillips. And together, they wasted no time interviewing and fingerprinting the stunned members of Jean's family and Jean's circle of social and work contacts. The first hurdle facing investigators was the fact that they had no crime scene. Because Jean's death had initially been attributed to natural causes, her apartment had been thoroughly cleaned and all her belongings packed away in boxes. So, without a crime scene or any physical evidence to guide them, detectives Maunger and Phillips immediately turned to the most obvious suspects. In any homicide investigation, the victim's romantic partners and spouses are automatically people of interest. But in this case, Jean's much younger boyfriend had a rock-solid alibi, and no one who knew Jean, either from her work or personal life, seemed to have any motive for wanting her dead. Knowing they needed to think outside the box if they were going to solve this case, Detective Maunger decided it was time to talk with the one person in a woman's life who might know more about her than even her closest friends. And that person was Jean's longtime beautician. Detective Maunger explained it to her partner this way. Being female, I know we talk about our lives to our hairdressers and manicurists. We use them as sounding boards. And on Tuesday, April 7th, the same day that Detective Maunger set off to talk with this new potential witness, investigators received a telephone call that changed everything. Within hours, police were combing through their backlog of cold cases, looking for the unsolved murder of a 71-year-old woman named Myra Davis, who had also lived in Cheviot Hills, and who had been raped and then strangled 10 years earlier. The tip that would help break these two murder cases came from a parole agent for the California Department of Corrections. According to John Widener, one of the released prisoners he supervised, a man who had served jail time for committing forgery, had heard about Jean Orlof's murder. And not only did the details of her death, sexual assault, and strangulation remind this ex-con of another earlier murder, but this ex-con also knew the name of one man who had a connection to both victims. 24 hours later, the pieces of two murder puzzles, along with a string of seemingly unrelated sex crimes that had happened in the late 1980s, suddenly and shockingly all fell into place. Over the weeks that followed, the names and images of Jean Orlof and Myra Davis, along with references to the 1960 horror classic Psycho, all started appearing in the pages and on the screens of state and then national media. Based on information contained in both those murder files, along with Detective Maunger's interview with Jean's manicurist and a series of interviews with the suspect named by the parole agent, here is a reconstruction of what happened on or about Tuesday, June 28, 1988, when 71-year-old Myra Davis was killed, and on March 29, 1998, 10 years later, when the same man murdered 60-year-old Jean Orlof. Back in 1988, Myra's killer had already developed a very unwholesome fascination with women and violence. And Myra, a vulnerable older woman he saw every day, had become an object of great interest to him. He knew a little bit about her, including the fact that she didn't seem to much like her neighbors, at least not all of them. He also knew she had made a living in Hollywood back when she was young, and that now she made commercials. He'd even seen her face on ads pitching old-time lemonade and the all-day breakfast served at the International House of Pancakes. He knew she had a very good-looking granddaughter who also worked in Hollywood, but on that day, in late June 1988, neither the neighbors or Myra's granddaughter were anywhere in sight. So, when the murderer knocked on Myra's door and called out respectfully if now was a good time for him to come visit, there was no one to see them when Myra opened the back door, gave him that TV smile, and invited him inside. There was also no one to see when the killer followed Myra out of the kitchen and into her bedroom. And Myra was surprised when, after their short but pleasant conversation had ended, she turned around and there he was, standing right behind her with a strange look on his face. For the killer, the explosive rage and sexual excitement that now filled him was familiar. They had been among the reasons why parents wanted nothing to do with him, why he had molested his own younger sister, why he had spent years in mental hospitals and juvenile detention facilities, and why he had sexually abused other children in those same settings. Myra had no way of knowing any of this. The killer's long rap sheet listing crimes he'd committed before the age of 18, when he was still considered a child, was protected by law from public view. And at that moment, knowing what her killer was capable of would not have mattered to the 71-year-old grandmother anyway, because now it was too late. This man was already there in her house, and when he suddenly came at her, the attack was so unexpected that Myra hardly had any time to process what was happening or to try to protect herself. According to the medical examiner's later autopsy report, what happened next was premeditated and brutal. Myra's killer stripped her of nearly all of her clothes and then forced her onto the bed where he raped her. Afterward, her killer wrapped a pair of nylon stockings around Myra's neck, then used the handle of a plastic pot scrubber he'd picked up on his way through the kitchen like a tourniquet to tighten the ligature around her throat. Throughout the attack, Myra was facing her killer. In the 60 to 90 seconds it took her to die from strangulation, the small bone below her jaw and inside her neck had slowly fractured. At the same time, the intense pressure on Myra's voice box caused her to reflexively bite down into her own tongue, even as the blood vessels in her eyes and under her skin and gums began to rupture and bleed. Before leaving Myra's house, the killer rifled through her purse and quickly opened and ransacked the 5 drawers of her bedroom dresser. Satisfied and exhilarated, the killer slipped out the door of Myra's house, leaving her body to the maggots and California's summer heat. Over the next week, Myra's killer spent several days on an alcohol-fueled bender. But by the time he was interviewed by police about Myra's death, he was sober and he had put together an alibi. He also knew he had been lucky. Myra's body was so badly decomposed by the time it was discovered that pinning down an exact date or time of death was practically impossible. And in the 2 years that followed the unsolved killing, police never connected Myra's murder with a string of at least 6 sexual assaults on young women in the Cheviot Hills area where Myra had lived. And when, in 1991, Myra's killer was arrested and charged with sexual battery in 2 of those attacks, the sentences against him were suspended, and instead of serving time, Myra's killer was put on probation and required to attend 1 year of sexual abuse counseling. The killer's next encounter with the law occurred on March 6, 1992, when an elderly couple out for a stroll in Cheviot Hills saw him kicking the small dog he was holding at the end of a leash. When the 67-year-old husband, who weighed less than 120 pounds, told the younger man to stop it, Myra's killer, enraged, stepped forward and struck the older man. The blow knocked him backward and he hit his head on the sidewalk with such force that 3 weeks later, he died. After spending 3 years in prison for manslaughter, Myra's killer was again released on parole, and moving back in with his wife, he started working side jobs for cash as a handyman. And by the beginning of 1998, one of his customers was an attractive and vibrant 60-year-old divorcee named Jean Orof. Not only did Jean live just several blocks away from the killer's first murder victim, but Jean's red and white vintage Chevrolet Malibu reminded the murderer of the tan and brown Chevy Malibu that had belonged to Myra, and how that car had sat in Myra's driveway collecting dust during those 7 days after he had killed her when she lay dead and undiscovered inside her little white bungalow. In fact, 10 years later, on March 28, 1998, there was so much about the visit he decided to make to Jean's apartment that would remind him of his visit to Myra a decade earlier. Like Myra, who was one of his early customers, Jean had always been happy to have his help around her home, starting back in late 1997 when he repainted a heavy mirror for her before hanging it over her piano. So when the killer had slipped away from his family's house that evening and driven the 3 miles to Jean's apartment, where he knocked quietly on her door, Jean welcomed him inside with a smile. Like Myra, Jean had no reason not to open the door. Like Myra, Jean had no idea what crimes this man had already committed, and she had no idea what he was about to do to her. But once the killer attacked, Jean fought back with every ounce of strength she had. And even though Detective Giles would later insist that Jean had died of natural causes, the autopsy that doctors performed 5 days after Jean's body was sent to the morgue told a very different story. Like Myra, Jean had been raped. But blunt force trauma to the back of her ribcage showed that the killer had probably had to jam his knee into her back to force her face into the mattress so he could subdue her. The ultimate cause of death was strangulation, although in Jean's case, the ragged furrows around her neck, the crushed voice box, and the abrasion on her chin, nose, and next to her mouth all suggested that she had fought desperately against the tightening of the ligature. When it was over, the killer left his victim naked and face down on top of her bed. The phone already lay on the floor, the receiver off the hook. As the killer's excitement subsided and his breathing returned to normal, he could hear the faint noise of the busy signal coming across the phone line. Before leaving, the killer set a small fire at the bottom edge of the bedskirt. Taking one last look around, the killer slipped out of Jean's apartment, leaving the door unlocked behind him. And just a few minutes after that, 32-year-old Kenneth Dean Hunt, who had been known to both Myra and Jean by his nickname, Sonny, was in his car heading back to the home he shared with his wife and her mother on South Beverly Drive in Cheviot Hills. And that house, owned by Adrian Rosenfeld and still overflowing with people, was located right next door to the little white bungalow where Myra Davis had lived for 40 years before Sonny had killed her back in 1988. It would turn out that the 32-year-old handyman who murdered both Myra Davis and Jean Orof had been the boyfriend of Adrian's younger daughter, the man who made most of his money doing odd jobs for their neighbors. 4 months after being interviewed and cleared as a possible suspect in Myra's murder, Sonny had gone on to marry Adrian's daughter. He had also cultivated a loving relationship with his mother-in-law. Adrian, along with her daughter, always found excuses for Sonny's inability to hold down a regular job, and they would both insist that later charges against him for sexual assault and manslaughter were unfounded. As Myra's neighbor, Adrian had made a point of recommending Sonny to Myra as a part-time handyman. And as the owner of a popular local beauty salon, Adrian made the same glowing recommendation to her older single female clients who also might appreciate the services of someone who could come to their home and do minor repairs and yard work. Once Sonny's wife began selling Avon products, he also worked as a delivery person, personally taking orders directly to the homes of his wife's clients. One of those clients was Jean Orof. Not only had Jean been a longtime customer at Adrian's nail salon, she had attended Adrian's big Halloween party in 1997. Jean also bought skin products from Adrian's daughter and hired Sonny as a part-time handyman. As for the tip that finally broke the 2 murder cases, that came from Adrian's son, Joel Steen. As a teenager, Joel may have creeped out Myra and her granddaughter Sherry with his unwanted attention, but it was a charge of forgery, not stalking, that would eventually land him in prison for a few years before he got out on parole. Unlike his mother, Joel had always suspected Sonny might have been involved in Myra's murder, especially when Sonny went on that bender in the days immediately after Myra's death. So when Joel heard the eerily similar details of Jean's murder and observed that following Jean's murder, Sonny went on another substance-fueled bender, Joel picked up the phone, called his parole officer, and suggested that police might want to take a look at Kenneth Hunt, aka Sonny. Meanwhile, Detective Maunger's interview with Jean's manicurist, Adrian Rosenfeld, would also lead investigators to make a direct link between Sonny and his 2 murder victims. And unlike the general public, investigators would also have access to Sonny's juvenile records that would detail his lengthy and disturbing history of violence and sexual assault. Samples of Sonny's semen would later match the samples collected from the bodies of both Myra and Jean. On Thursday, April 9, 1998, less than 2 weeks after Jean's murder, Kenneth Sonny Hunt was arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, burglary, and forcible rape. In yet another strange twist to this case, in the press coverage that surrounded Sonny's arrest, His first victim, Myra Davis, was wrongly identified not as a stand-in on the set of the movie Psycho, but as the body double who actually appeared nude in the shower scene that made the movie famous. That mistake led to speculation that Sonny had been obsessed with killing that body double who he believed, incorrectly, to be his next-door neighbor. True or not, the mistake brought a kind of notoriety to Myra Davis that the modest 71-year-old grandmother had never pursued or wanted in the course of her half-century-long career in Hollywood. On March 15, 2001, Kenneth Dean Hunt, aka Sonny, was found guilty of 2 counts of first-degree murder. 8 months later, on November 6th, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In 2006, a 14-year-old boy named Evan lived on a farm in North Carolina. This was not a typical farm with animals and crops. It was a pine tree harvestry. Pine needles are a big landscaping commodity, and Evan and his family made their living baling pine straw every year. As such, their main living house on the farm was situated right in the middle of 550 acres of perfectly lined up pine trees. They did not have any neighbors nearby, and there was only one road that led into the property, which from the main house, they could look out and basically see through the rows of trees all the way to the beginning of this road, which meant any visitors were really easy to spot. The main house was built on a very slight hill, which meant one side of the house was effectively built on stilts to compensate for the angle. And on that side of the house, on the first floor, was the living room. So anyone who was in the living room looking out the window, they basically need to look at a downward angle to see the ground. It would actually seem like you were on the second floor, but really you're on the first floor. The window in the living room was very unique. It stretched almost the entire length of the room, so almost 50 feet across. And at night, you could see animals darting between the different trees because you could see down the rows. And so that was pretty creepy. And then just the fact that this window is so big, if you're in the living room at night, you just felt really exposed. So between the creepy animals running around and the level of exposure and vulnerability, people basically avoided the living room anytime they were in the house at night. That winter, Evan's cousin came to stay with him on his farm, and because the main house did not have any extra bedrooms, Evan and his cousin would have to sleep in the living room. There were 2 couches inside of the living room, one that was right underneath the 50-foot long window, and then another which was on the other side of the room against a wall that did not have a window. And so Evan would be sleeping on the couch right under the window, and his cousin would be sleeping on the other couch. The first night Evan's cousin was there, they put this big sheet up over the window, but it only blocked like 75% of the window. The 2 flanks of the window were still exposed, but where the couches were lined up, they were kind of blocked by this sheet, so it gave them a little bit of privacy. After goofing around for a while, the boys finally fell asleep around midnight, and then they woke up a couple hours later because they heard Evan's dogs barking way off in the pine trees. Now, Evan was used to his dogs running around the property and barking at other smaller animals, and so just them barking was not necessarily a red flag. But the barking persisted to the point where Evan's cousin got up off the couch, moved across the room to the opening of the window that was not covered by the sheet at the foot of where Evan was sleeping. Now, Evan was still laying on the couch. He was not going to get up and look out the window, so he's looking down at his cousin, kind of looking at his face to get some sort of a read on what he's seeing. And he notices his cousin has this really perplexed look on his face, like he's squinting his eyes and trying to make sense of what he's looking at. And so Evan looks at him and says, "Hey, what's going on? What do you see?" And his cousin's like, "I don't know if my mind's playing tricks on me or not, but I'm pretty sure I see people out there." At this, Evan jumps off the couch and runs over and butts up right next to his cousin so he can look out the window too. And he's scanning out amongst the rows of trees because there's just a mile of pine trees. And the first thing he notices is the moon is very bright that night. So there's good illumination, and there was a light snow covering on the ground, which really added to the illumination. He's looking out maybe 100 meters when he sees someone's leg extend from behind one of the pine trees as if they're stepping into the space between a pine tree column. And he's staring at it, and he can't believe he's even seeing anyone walking around this area because he didn't see anybody come in on the road and they have no neighbors. And so he's looking, and then a body follows the leg. A person walks from one row to the next. This tall, dark figure just walks calm as can be between the 2 pine trees. And Evan just grabs his cousin and he's like, "Did you just see that?" And his cousin's like, "Yeah, I saw that." And so they continue to look in the direction of where this person crossed the path. And after a couple of minutes, they see another leg now emerging, going the other way, back towards where that first person had come from. So the leg kind of extends into this gap, and this tall figure walks across into the next row, except now, instead of going just directly across, it looks like they're moving at an angle closer to the main house property. The boys look at each other and they don't know what to do, so they just keep looking out the window in stunned silence. And as they're looking, they see this person emerge again, except now they're not 100 meters away, they're like 20 meters away. They don't know how they were able to move that quickly without being seen. And this time when the leg comes out from behind the pine tree, instead of walking across the gap, it stops right in the middle and it turns and looks directly at the boys in the window and then begins running toward them. The boys practically fall over trying to get away from the window. Evan's yelling for his father upstairs, and the boys instinctively just start running around the house, locking every door, shutting every window. And as they're going from door to door, the anxiety is growing and growing because they think, if I don't get there fast enough, this person who was running towards the property is going to come barging through that door. And so at every door, their anxiety is through the roof, but they manage to shut everything. Everything is locked right as Evan's father comes charging down the stairs. He's got his gun in hand and he's like, what's going on? And they say, there's someone out in our property. Their dad charges out the front door. The front door is not on the same wall as the living room. It's on the side of the house. So once he goes outside, he's going to need to turn to the right to look out in the direction they were describing. He bombs outside, he stays on the porch, and he starts yelling at whoever's out there that if you come over here, I'm going to shoot you, get the F away from here. And then there's silence. And the boys are waiting, they're looking around, they're checking the window. They don't see anything. The dad comes back inside, he shut and locks the door, and he tells Evan, keep an eye out. If you see him again, you let me know. Evan would reflect on this experience later on and say, we really should have called 911 at that point. But as a kid, I just understood that that's the way my family did business. We kind of took care of ourselves. And so even though there is a threat of some stranger who's running at our property, we were not going to call the cops. And so his dad effectively was telling him to be a lookout. And so Evan and his cousin, they go back into the living room and they kind of go up to the window. They're a little bit apprehensive and they're looking out. And after 5-10 minutes of looking out the window and not seeing anything, they're thinking to themselves, Evan's dad's a pretty intimidating guy. And he was just out there screaming and yelling with a gun, threatening to shoot them. So they probably got the message and they're probably gone. And so the boys got back into their couches and it took them a while, but they did ultimately fall asleep. The next morning when the boys got up, the first thing they wanted to do was go out there and see if they could find footprints from this person to kind of confirm it really was a person, because part of them thought, maybe we didn't see that. Maybe that was our imaginations. They don't know. And so they start by going out the front door, so not on the same wall as the living room. They go out the front door, they turn and they walk down into the trees, and they're looking around and they find some footprints. So they're confirming to themselves, okay, there was someone out here. It wasn't us. This is not our footprints. We found them. So they start following the footprints back towards the property, and they realize at some point there are two distinct sets of footprints. There were two people out here. And even worse is they followed them all the way up to the house. And there were two different circles of footprints that stopped right underneath the living room window along the two flanks of the window where the sheet was not covering. Which means over the course of the night, when Evan and his cousin were up at that window looking out, there's a good chance that one or two strangers were tucked up against the side of the house. And they would not have seen them because of the angle out of the living room window. It was steep because of the stilts it was on. And so anybody that was tucked up along the side, they'd be in a blind spot. And then for sure, after Evan and his cousin got back into bed and were sleeping, there were two strangers who were right up against those windows, probably pulling themselves up to look inside. When Evan's father found these footprints, he immediately grabbed his gun and tried to follow them back into the woods to see where they came from, but unfortunately the snow cover wasn't complete, and at some point they lost the tracks and they never figured out who those two people were. Evan would say, following this event, his cousin refused to ever come back over his house for a sleepover. The next and final story of today's episode is called tintinnabulation. In June of 2019, an 18-year-old girl named Bella wrapped up her first year in college and headed home for the summer. Her family lived just outside of this small town in France that was tucked up in the mountains and surrounded by this huge forest. And so growing up, Bella spent a lot of her time out in this forest, either by herself or with her father or other members of her family. And so she knew the forest like the back of her hand. Her favorite place to go in this forest was the man-made lake that sat kind of at the center of this forest. It wasn't huge, but it was a beautiful view, it was very peaceful, and so she liked going out there. The way she would get to it is she would leave her house, she would hop in her car, she would drive a couple of miles down the road, and she would pull off into the shoulder of this road, and there was no signage that said this was the pull-off to get to the man-made lake. This was an area that she and her family had discovered, that there was this particular trail you could take. And so she would pull off at this shoulder, she would get out, and she would turn away from the road and just walk directly into the trees, which butted right up against the road. And very quickly, after walking into the woods, after going through some thick underbrush, she would reach this kind of clearing and she would see up ahead this little stream. And off to the left side of this stream is what looked like this kind of beaten up little footpath, but actually what it was an animal trail. So animals just kind of made their way around this area all the time, and so it kind of carved out a path. And so Bella would walk down to this animal path, and she would walk along the path that kind of went parallel with the stream, and she would walk for maybe 15 or 20 minutes until this animal path veered hard to the left, kind of went away from the stream. At that point, Bella would abandon the animal path and just continue walking along this stream, both stepping in the stream on some rocks and standing on either side when she could. And she would follow the stream due north, just going straight into the heart of this forest for about an hour, walking at a fairly leisurely pace until the stream connected with this east to west running river. And at this point, Bella would turn left facing west, and she would follow along this riverbank about 20 minutes until the river fed into the man-made lake. And so she would stay at this lake, sitting on a rock, enjoy the view and look at the animals and listen to nature all around her. And then at some point she would turn around and retrace her steps all the way back to her car. For reference, one leg of this journey from car to lake or from lake to car took about 2 hours. Part of the reason Bella really enjoyed being in these woods and being at this lake was because it just kind of felt like they were hers. Because up until this summer in 2019, the only other people that Bella had ever seen anywhere in this forest or near this lake were other members of her family. So it really felt very private. So in June of that year, Bella comes home from college, and almost immediately she wants to go out to the man-made lake because she hasn't been in months. She's been in school, and so she's eager to get back to some place that she kind of considered to be her happy place. So one morning she gets up early and by herself, she leaves her house, she hops in her car, she drives the couple miles down the road, she pulls off onto that shoulder, she parks her car, she hops out, she turns away from the road, she walks into the forest, she finds the stream and starts walking along that animal path right to the side of the stream. She walks for a few minutes until she reaches the point where the trail kind of cuts to the left, and she just stays on the stream and is just continuing walking along the stream. And about 30 minutes later, when she was maybe 1 or 2 miles short of the east-west running river, she hears a bell somewhere off in the distance, way out in front of her, out towards the river. It sounds just like a chime, a single chime. And as soon as she hears it, she stops because there's never any people out here ever. And that bell sound came from somewhere in the forest. And so she stops because she's not really sure if she actually heard that, because it could have just been her mind playing tricks on her or something. And so she stops and just kind of listens for a second. And then she starts to hear this bell just continuously start ringing. Now, the ringing was not uniform. It was constant, but it was kind of sporadic, as if you were holding a bell and kind of ringing it randomly, like you might see at a sports game. And so she's thinking to herself, is there a dog that got lost somewhere up ahead and it's got a bell on its collar and that's the sound I'm hearing? But as she's sitting there listening to this kind of sporadic bell sound, she's thinking, that's way too loud to be some rinky-dink bell on a pet's collar. So it's got to be something more robust. Maybe somebody have a bell inside of a box and that box got on the river and it's floated down river and it's like crashing into rocks or something. I mean, she's going through these very strange scenarios in her head, but she's not concerned about the bell. She's actually pretty intrigued, and since the sound of this bell seemed to be coming from the direction she was already traveling, she decided she would just keep on walking and hopefully see whatever it was that was causing this bell sound. And so Bella just began walking along the stream again, kind of listening to this bell and thinking about what it was going to be. And after about 5 minutes of her starting to walk again, the bell just stops. It goes totally silent. And when it does, it actually kind of startles Bella because she'd been listening to it so intently. And so she stops and she's listening, kind of expecting it to go off some more, but it doesn't. All she hears are the sounds of nature all around her. Now, Bella didn't have an explanation for what this bell was or why it stopped, but she really just wasn't that worried about it. She figured there was some sort of explanation for it. There had to be. And so she just kind of shrugged and kept on walking and put her focus back on getting to the lake. About 10 or 15 minutes later, Bella was still walking along the stream. She was still maybe a half mile or a mile short of the east to west running river when she sees up ahead on the left side of the stream as she's walking, there appears to be something laying on the ground that looks like it could be an animal or a rock. She doesn't really know what it is. And as she gets closer, she realizes it's a beaver laying on the ground, and this beaver is missing its head. Now, this is a huge forest, and Bella would have known that, of course, there are wild animals all over the place, and so finding the body of an animal that had been attacked by another animal was not unusual. That's nature. But what did strike Bella as odd was the cut on this beaver's neck was unbelievably neat and uniform, as if its head had been very carefully removed with a very sharp knife. And the beaver's head was nowhere to be found. It certainly did not have the appearance of having its head removed from some predator and its teeth. That would have been very rough. Also, the rest of the beaver's body was intact, so whatever killed this beaver was not interested in eating the beaver. As Bella stood over this beaver and was just staring at it, she also noted that there was no smell. Normally, when something dies, it begins to smell very quickly. It's part of the decomposition process. And so for there not to be a smell indicated to Bella that this beaver must have been killed fairly recently. And then when Bella kind of gently prodded the body with her foot, she realized the beaver's body was still fairly limp, so rigor mortis had not set in. Rigor mortis is another part of the decomposition process where the body kind of stiffens up, and that happens fairly soon after death. And so as Bella is realizing this beaver must have died very recently, it dawns on her that most likely whoever or whatever has killed this beaver is probably somewhere nearby. And Bella can't help but connect this dead beaver to that bell she was hearing earlier, which before meant nothing, but considering the bell was roughly coming from the same area where this beaver has now been found, it made her uneasy. And so Bella found herself whipping her head around, looking out into the trees, seeing if, there's some person, a hunter or somebody that would kind of explain what was going on, but there was nothing. And so Bella felt herself starting to panic a little bit, but then she stopped herself and said, "Calm down. It's broad daylight. I have been coming to these woods for years and years. I've never seen another person. I've never encountered some predatory animal. I'm sure everything is perfectly fine. I got nothing to worry about." And so she stepped over the beaver and kept on walking. Bella would eventually reach the east-west running river. She would turn left and walk for 20 minutes alongside this river. She'd reach the man-made lake. She enjoyed the beautiful view and the scenery, and then at some point she turned around and began retracing her footsteps. She walked past the beaver on the ground all the way back to her car, and she went home. A week later, Bella was sitting around her house when she felt pretty bored and decided kind of abruptly that in order to cure her boredom, she would go back to the place she loved so much, the man-made lake. And so she told her parents where she was going, and then she left the house, hopped in her car, drove to the pull-off, and parked and entered the woods at 6 p.m. Sunset that night was at 9 p.m., and so Bella knew this would need to be a fairly quick turnaround so she didn't get trapped in the woods in the dark. And so Bella finds the animal trail. She follows along the stream until the trail goes left and she stays on the stream. She continues walking on the stream when she starts to hear the distant sound of thunder. And so she looks up into the sky through the trees and she can see the sky is starting to get dark, but she's still a couple of hours away from sunset. And so between the thunder and the dark skies, she knows a storm is rolling in. But she is determined to get to that lake. And so instead of, turning around and saying, okay, I'll come back another time, she just starts jogging along the stream to get there as fast as she possibly can. And almost immediately as she's jogging, the raindrops start to fall. And by the time she passes the beaver corpse on the ground, it hadn't moved, the rain was really coming down. And then about 15 minutes after the corpse, when she hit the east-west running river, that's when the rain was at a full downpour. Still, Bella turned at the river and continued west towards the man-made lake as if she was going to go all the way, but only about a minute or two into this final leg. She still had about 20 minutes to get to the lake. She stops herself and she looks at her watch and she can see it's after 8 o'clock already. And she's thinking to herself, if I turn around right now, it's going to take me over an hour to get back to my car. Sunsets at 9 p.m. It's after 8 p.m. now. So already I know I'm going to have to navigate this forest at night in the dark, even if it's just for a little bit at the end. And if I go all the way to the lake and then come all the way back to the car, I'm going to be in the forest after dark for quite a while, maybe up to an hour. And she's thinking, I'm confident I can do that, but it's also pouring rain, I'm cold. If I get lost, this could turn into a very bad situation. And so she ultimately decides that even though she really wants to keep going, she needs to turn around, she needs to head back. And so she turns around and she walks back up alongside this east-west running river to where the stream fed into that river. She turns and begins walking south along this stream, headed back towards the car. On her walk, because the visibility was starting to get quite bad because it was so dark, she had her head down at the ground because she didn't want to trip. She's stepping on rocks, she's stepping on muddy areas. She wants to make sure her footing is solid. And so her head is down, the rain is pounding all around her, and she's walking for about 15 minutes when all of a sudden, something hits her in the top of the head. And so reflexively, she looks up and kind of puts her hands in front of her face to protect herself, and she sees what she had just run into. It was the beaver corpse. It was hanging from a string that was dangling off a branch right above her. And this beaver's head had been retrieved, and the head had been stitched onto the front paws of this beaver. And so she's looking at this beaver that's dangling from this rope. It's carrying its own head, and she's walked square into it. And her first reaction was basically to gag. She was going to vomit. She was so disgusted. And then she began frantically rubbing at her hair where this thing had made contact with her because there could be juices from the decomposition that got on her. And then after frantically kind of patting at her head for a second, she stops and something really terrifying dawns on her. Whoever strung this beaver up to this tree and then stitched its head onto its paws, they had done that in the last 30 minutes. Because 30 minutes earlier, when she was on her way in, she remembered passing the beaver carcass on the ground. She saw it. It had not moved from where it was the week before when she first saw it. And now this beaver is strung up in the tree. And so as the wheels are turning in Bella's head, she realizes that if someone has just done this, then they are probably nearby. And at this point, it's really starting to get dark. The rain is pounding all around her, and she starts whipping her head around, looking in all directions to see if there's someone out there that did this. But as she's looking, all she sees is just dark forest in all directions. And she knows she's at least 1 hour, even if she runs from her car. And so suddenly, she is totally panicked, and in an effort to calm herself down, she says to herself, okay, I need to get out of here, but I have to walk. If I start running right now, this is going to turn into a complete nightmare. I just have to try to walk. And so she walks around this dangling beaver corpse and starts walking along the stream. And as soon as she's past that corpse, she feels the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. She can hear movement behind her. She doesn't know what it is. It could be a deer, it could be some animal, but she's too afraid to turn around. And even though she was trying to tell herself to calm down, just keep walking, you're safe, you're freaking yourself out, everything is okay, as she's walking, she could feel herself starting to speed up until finally she was just running down this stream, sprinting actually away from this beaver and whatever it was that was moving around in that area. And at some point, she got so winded from sprinting so fast that she came to a stop, maybe 5 or 6 minutes after seeing this beaver. And as soon as she comes to a stop and she's walking, she still hasn't turned around yet, she hears the sound of that bell. And right away, it's the exact same sound she had heard the week before. It's that kind of constant, sporadic sound of someone ringing a bell. But in her panic state, she doesn't know where it's coming from. She's so scared. Her anxiety is so high. She doesn't know if it's behind her or if it's off to the side. It's now completely dark out. And so she is full-blown terrified. There is someone or something behind her that has strung this beaver up that's probably watching her, and she can't see them. Even though she's beyond winded, she can barely breathe, she just starts sprinting as fast as she can. And as she's stumbling and falling on the rocks and tripping because she's not really looking where she's going, in the background and all around her, she's hearing this bell chiming and she's hearing something moving around in the woods behind her. And she pulls her phone out of her pocket, her iPhone. And as she's running, she dials her father. She puts the phone to her ear. She's crying. She's panting. She can barely breathe. Her father picks up and she's so relieved to hear his voice, but she can't even make a sentence. She just starts crying and wailing and pleading with him. Dad, come out to the forest. Meet me at the spot where the trail veers away from the stream. Meet me there. There's someone in the forest that's chasing me and I can't see them. Her father on the other end of the phone, he didn't know what to make of this, but he could hear the primal fear in his daughter's voice. And so he didn't ask any questions. He said, stay on the line. I'm coming to meet you right now. So Bella's father and mother, with Bella on the line, they run out of their house, they hop in their car, they speed the couple miles down the road, they park next to their daughter's car, and as they're running into the woods, they can hear way off in the woods the sound of the bell. They can hear the bell, they hear their daughter screaming on the phone, they can hear the bell coming through the phone, and she's begging them to please come into the woods, come in here, save me. And so the parents run into the woods and they begin running up the stream. Meanwhile, Bella, who's way out in the woods, she's still 10 or 15 minutes away from her parents. She is barely able to run at this point. She's exhausted almost all of her energy. And as she's getting closer and closer to her parents, the sporadic bell sound is getting louder and louder and louder, like whatever it is gaining on her. And she can hear behind her all these sticks and branches. They're breaking as if something is coming up to her. And finally, when it feels like this bell is right behind her head, she just kind of stops in defeat. She's too far away from her parents. She can't get to them in time. And so it was almost like she had to turn around and finally look at whatever it was that was behind her. And so terrified beyond words, Bella, who can barely breathe, she's so scared and so tired, she slowly turns around. Now, when she turns around and she's facing the other direction, she's looking across this clearing. She just happened to run past this clearing, and because it was a clearing, there was a little bit of moonlight that was coming down through the trees, just enough to illuminate this space that was about 50 feet wide. And as she's looking across this clearing, at first, she doesn't see anything. And then this tall, dark figure walks into the clearing, and as soon as it steps in, she can see it's got a bell at its waist. And with every step it took, it would violently ring the bell, causing the ringing sound. And so this thing starts moving into the clearing, and as Bella is staring at it, it was like time slowed down. She could not process what she was looking at. She didn't know what she was looking at. All she knew is whatever or whoever this is, they're coming straight at me. And so Bella suddenly got this unbelievable adrenaline rush. It was like her body went into autopilot to save her, and she turned around and began sprinting faster than she had ever sprinted in her life. And as she ran, all she could hear was the sound of that bell, which she now knew represented steps this thing was taking. And so the bell was getting faster and faster and louder, and she knew it was gaining on her. And she began lying and screaming out loud that, "I'm on the phone with the police. They're right up ahead. They're going to be here any moment." But whatever it was that was behind her, they weren't fazed. They were just charging ahead, gaining on her second by second. Meanwhile, her parents had made it to the meeting spot, but her father, he felt like, I can't just sit here. And he just starts charging into the woods. He can hear his daughter screaming. He can hear this bell getting louder and louder. And he just starts running towards it. And sure enough, seconds later, he sees his daughter come bounding out of the forest, and she leaps into his arms. He just grabs her, turns around, and runs with her back to the meeting spot. He grabs his wife, and the three of them just charge out of the forest, back to the parking lot, back in their car, and they speed off. In the car, all of them are crying. They don't know what to make of what just happened. Bella's trying to describe it, but she can't. And her parents, they had been on the phone listening to their daughter screaming, and all they kept saying to each other, the parents, was, "I heard the bell. I heard the bell. I heard the bell," as if the bell confirmed their worst nightmares, that there really was someone or something out in those woods that was trying to do harm to their child. They would drive straight to the police station where Bella would file a report about what she experienced out in the forest. And then afterwards, her parents, as a precaution, took her to the hospital where she was determined to be okay, besides some bumps and bruises from falling down. The following morning, the police went out to the forest, to the area where Bella had explained where she had been, and they searched all along that animal foot trail and all along the stream, but they never found any sign of this dark figure with the bell. Bella would tell police that she had a handbag, and as she was running back, she dropped the bag. She remembered where she dropped it along the stream, but when the police went to that area, the bag was gone. Also, the beaver was no longer there. It was not tied up to the tree. It was not on the ground. It was gone. The only thing police found that was out of the ordinary was they found a little ways off from the stream, basically along the path that Bella would have been running on, they found a t-shirt neatly folded placed underneath a rock. But the police and Bella and her family have no idea what that signifies. Ultimately, the police told Bella and her family that more than likely what she ran into was some kind of mentally unstable person that was living out in the woods, and perhaps when Bella came into the woods, they felt like she was on their property, and so they kind of tried to scare her off. But Bella has a hard time accepting that. She felt like, as she was running from whoever was behind her, that she was in mortal danger. That had it not been for her father running into the woods and literally grabbing her and running with her the rest of the way, that she may not have gotten out of the woods at all, that she might have been attacked and killed by whoever this was. She also can't help, when she looks back at the entire experience, thinking about that moment when she turned around and looked across that clearing and saw this figure come into the moonlight for the first time. That when it came into the moonlight, the way it was moving, the steps it was taking, they weren't normal, they were abnormal. There was just something off about this thing's movement, that it didn't seem like she was looking at a person, but rather some big animal. But regardless, since her ordeal, there have been no strange sightings out in those woods. However, almost no one ever goes in those woods except for Bella and her family. And Bella and her family, they don't go in those woods anymore. So whoever or whatever is out there is still just out there. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please text the Amazon Music follow button that you have something extremely important to tell them. Then text them a GIF of the typing dots. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called Mr. Ballin. We have a registered 501c3 charitable organization called the MrBallen's Foundation that honors and supports victims of violent crime, as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen's Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to mrballin.foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some